Hello spicy people of the internet, Spice8Rack here, aka Albatross Disaster, and welcome back to the channel. This video is made possible thanks to all of my supporters on patreon.com, like Thomas Quinlan, who was my first new supporter in August. Thanks Thomas! One thing that you might not know about me is that in late 2017, I killed a man and have yet to be caught by the authorities. Wait, that was the wrong secret. That was the wrong secret! One thing that you might not know about me is that for years, whenever anyone has asked me what my favourite plane and set in Magic the Gathering's history is, I've always answered Lorwyn, despite never actually playing with it. The diversity of Magic the Gathering's game worlds stretch from classical fantasy to biomechanical horror to China. Just China in the past. However, apart from occasionally scrolling through its cards on Scryfall.com and owning a Hate Bears Gaddock-Teeg EDH deck, forgive me for my sins, I've never truly engaged with this set. I didn't know that Magic the Gathering existed by the time that Lorwyn came out, much less the set itself. I'd never engaged with any of the novels attached to the world, and even if I wanted to go back and see what games of Lorwyn looked like, all of the video footage that Magic the Gathering has available from the mid to late 2000s all kind of look and play like this.
Sounds like a turn to siege towers being assembled. Unless...
Bird off the gemstone, Pat Chapin does not hesitate, shocks the bird.
Like, I understand that my disdain for watching 144p Magic the Gathering gameplay videos on YouTube somewhat stems from being spoiled by things like Shuffle Up and Play and Game Nights and their amazing production value, but I mean, like, look, these cuts, I'm not making these cuts, like, entire seconds of turns are being lost, and the green really doesn't help. And because Magic is an ever-changing game, unless you were there in the room when a set was released and got to play with it as it was defining and shaping formats around it at the time, then you never truly can know what it was like to play with that set. I mean, you could go out and buy a booster box of Lorwyn and try and sort out a draft pod to see what the limited environment was like, but here's the thing, right? There's a lot of Magic that I've never played with that I do not have this kind of fascination about. My first Magic the Gathering pre-release was Born of the Gods in late 2014, which means that I've never truly played with Mirrodin, Alara, Old Dominaria, Old Grother, Ravnica before everybody got sick of it, or Innistrad before it was even more tired than it was to begin with. But out of all of those worlds and more, Lorwyn is the only one that I found and find myself captivated by. The only one that I long to return to regardless of grander story significance. This despite the fact that Lorwyn at the time that it was released was deemed to be kind of a dud and a failure. So much so that it's been cited multiple times by many Magic the Gathering games designers as one of the reasons why Magic's design philosophy shifted in the late 2000s. So I asked myself why. Why this set? Why this world? What is it that entices me so much about Lorwyn despite its apparent shortcomings? And what even are those shortcomings in the first place? And so I began to unpick Lorwyn, and after weeks of research and analysis, I feel compelled to passionately defend this brilliant set and the wonderful world building that I have found. Also, during lockdown, I got really into watching and rewatching lengthy analysis about entertainment media I've never engaged with, nor ever probably will. And that trend has just sort of continued and snowballed into a full-blown habit. So now it's my turn to produce a potentially multi-hour video essay about a niche piece of games media that only I could give this much of a shit about. Suffer with me! A need for Twee. To begin with, I want to lay out what first drew me to this world. I grew up in the English countryside, and when you do something silly like that, you attain a certain cultural predisposition to enjoying a specific kind of iconography and aesthetic. No, not Murderous Empire, you silly dolt. Those are the people who retire in the countryside. I'm talking about Tweeness. Everywhere you look in the UK, at least on the surface, there's something delightfully twee. Twee being defined as something quaint, pretty, or sentimental. I can't even talk about the places that I've lived without twee vibes emanating from them. For example, I spent my early years in a town called Cardigan in Wales, and now live in a city called Bath in England, with my best friend coming from another village called Box, where Thomas the Tank Engine was created. On the topic of media, without access to something like Sky TV and the US-centric shows found therein, most of my early media experience was defined by VHSs and Freeview showings of TV shows like Thomas the Tank Engine, Mr. Bean, and Mr. Ben. All of which felt like their budget was whatever happened to be in the producer's wallet on the day, and which were mixed with formative literature like Wind in the Willows, Peter Rabbit, and Mr. Men, all of which are utterly adorable, and all of which, if you ever visited my home city, could be read over a cream tea at Sally Lunn's Buns after you purchased them all from Mr. B's Emporium of Reading Delights. I swear, shit's like living in a fucking watercolour postcard over here.
It's a fairy tale fucking town, isn't it? How can a fairy tale town not be somebody's fucking thing? How can all those canals and bridges and cobble streets and those churches and all that beautiful fucking fairy tale stuff, how can that not be somebody's fucking thing, eh?
What I think I meant to say was...
Is the swans still there?
Yeah, the swans.
How can fucking swans not fucking be somebody's fucking thing?
Alright, just to kind of hammer home the fact that there's this weird sort of like layer of twee that just kind of sits on top of everything in England. There's a fun game that I like to play, which I maintain that you can take a map of England and zoom in on any random point, and you will find a place name that sounds like the starting location of a very low-stakes D&D campaign in a generic fantasy setting. And I want to show this game off right now. So we're literally just going to take a random point. I don't know, near Middlesbrough, and what have we got? Let's have a little look. Gursby, we could do better than that. High and Low Walsall, okay. Appleton Whisk! Alright, I want to try this again, because I know there are some absolute corkers knocking about. Alright, alright, let's have a look. Wait, fucking New Zealand? Go Taker! S tier! I mean, Go Taker S tier, New Zealand just confusing tier, but this is such a fun game to play. What I mean by all this is that it should go some way to explain my near primal fascination and love for the world of Lorwyn. I grew up with the very world around me seemingly designed to emanate quaintness, and when it very much didn't, because, hey, turns out actually if you examine it for more than half a second, England kind of sucks actually. The majority of my early escapism was even more twee. So when I got into Magic and saw a plane of funny little guys and silly big doofuses getting into hijinks, it was always going to activate some deep neuron inside my brain. Even the names of Lorwyn and Morningtide's cards fill me with sentimental euphoria. Frog Tosser Banneret, Stink Drinker Daredevil, Spring Cleaning, Foot Bottom Feast, Squeaking Pie Sneak. I honestly had to fight to make this example list not exclusively Goblin cards. The great river that courses through the plain is called the Wander Wine, and the goat creatures that the Kithkin ride are called Springjacks. God, it's so cute! Even a card like Noggin Whack, whose effects in other planes of the multiverse would be depicted as being caused by sinister magic or visceral trauma, is instead rendered deeply silly, both through its name and its art, which is a scene of a Kithkin being struck from behind by a fish tied to a brick. even explaining the art in front of me is causing a big dumb smile to come across my big dumb face. Indeed, a whole lot of Lorwyn and Morningtide's removal spells, whose mechanics have the same effects as cards like Bombard or Claustrophobia, are recast in a far more light-hearted manner in cards like Giant's Ire, which depicts a cow being used as a projectile weapon, and Glimmer Dust Nap, which shows a pleasant snooze. Quite in contrast to the... One of the early design ideas that Aaron Forsyth, the lead designer of the set, and others pitched was to actually have the set free from removal to really hammer home this feeling of Twee idyll.
So that niceness of like trying to make this set that was friendlier led us into some strange places. Like initially we were just talking about the level of removal should be really low, or removal should be really weak, because there's not a lot of killing going on in this world.
But because a set dominated by creatures not having removal spells would be so unplayable it hurts to even think about, the decision was made to have removal, but to defang the implication of death, either by making the removal slapstick-esque, or by lowering the stakes of removal from outright murder to slightly sinister headaches. This isn't to say that all of Lorwyn's cards are picture book-esque. There are a number of cards, removal spells or otherwise, which depict some pretty grim and macabre scenes. Neck Snap is an unambiguous deadly assault, and Nameless Inversion is a genuinely horrifying image. But these very sparse elements of genuine threat only serve to enhance the world around them. A central theme of Lorwyn is the theme of duality, of light and dark, and of contrast. We'll talk far more in depth about that later, but for now, the few scenes of pain and suffering in this world stick out sharply against the otherwise overwhelming tranquility, which serves to make them far more notable images, but also to provide depth to this world. The expressive, enigmatic, but also humble character of creature types like the Flamekin of Lorwyn are given an additional depth by cards like Consuming Bonfire.
The elves use Treefolk to drive us away. It is time to remove their tools.
Through this, we're shown that whilst for the most part these creatures are peaceful, curious travellers, there is a real limit to their politeness. It makes each society feel far more real and fleshed out compared to a society where everything is either shades of pure evil or different kinds of altruistic goodness. In Lorwyn, this ratio of seriousness to playfulness exists pretty much exactly in the inverse to how these scenes appear in most other settings in Magic, and I feel this ratio works a lot better in this inverse. A moment or two of comedy in an otherwise serious set more often than not feels like those moments in Marvel movies where a high-stakes action scene or touching moment is interrupted by a meaningless gag.
How long have you been at Kamatage, Mr.
Doctor.
Mr. Doctor?
It's strange.
Maybe. Who am I to judge?
Yeah, sorry, you're gonna have to do a little bit more than rising violins to make the death of another human dramatic after you've just done a fucking who's on first bit. Jesus Christ. Seeing a werewolf pull a goofy face as Teferi freezes time around it during its rampage through a festival aimed at averting the apocalypse of eternal night feels jarring and lessens the tension of the world and scene. Contrastly is not a word, is not a fucking word. Contrastly, pick it, either in contrast or conversely. You can't have them both, Spice. Conversely, in contrast, fuck you past Spice, seeing a Kithkin's head melt into screeching ravens during a set that otherwise could be described as The Wind in the Willows meets Hobbiton hints at a darkness just under the surface of this entire world. A bottomless, watery chasm, sheltered from the sun by dragonflies and lily pads.
Dark thoughts hatch and twist within the mind, straining to take wing.
This isn't to say that serious media can't include comedy to great effect, even within Magic the Gathering. The card Farm to Market in Hour of Devastation is an out-and-out joke, but the punchline is a terribly dark one that also adds to the audience's understanding of the changing role of Amonkhet's mummies as they transition from automata for the Plains humans to killing machines for Nicol Bolas. Contrasting tones should always seek to elevate and enhance what they're contrasting with, not just contrasting for the sake of contrast. But returning to Lorwyn, the set's alternative aesthetic direction when it comes to aspects of the game, such as removal pieces that we would otherwise assume to be presented in one specific way, is always refreshing to see. Much like anything that goes against the grain of traditional design choices, I think the game is far better for having worlds like this in them. And it's this going against the grain that really makes Lorwyn stand out as a whole. After all, it's one thing for a world to be built in a way that's pleasing for one particular kind of person, but quite another for it to be striking and interesting for even a casual viewer. The designers of this set produced something that, still to this day, is a unique entity in the rest of Magic's canon, even down to the ideologies of its inhabitants. The designers of Lorwyn gave this world a feeling most unique. Lorwyn is a world made mostly up of creatures that other planes of Magic had, up until that point, either never explored or explored through limited, traditional fantasy tropes. But to begin with, I want to talk about absences. Outside of the 4 human planeswalkers in the first set, these cards themselves originally intended to appear in Future Sight but pushed back to Lorwyn to give designers more time to get them right, there are no humans on this plane. On every other plane in Magic, the world of that plane is either defined by the structure of a human-dominant society or viewed through the lens of how a human-hostile world treats humanity. By omitting humans completely from the narrative, the world building of Lorwyn had to be structured in a totally different way to every other world in Magic that had come before it, and even every other world in Magic that has come since. As a result of a world without humans, much less human protagonists, intricacies within the world, like conflicts between Lorwyn's different tribes as well as conflicts within them, take much higher precedent. Without a standard perspective to fall back on, the world builders had to flesh out the intricacies of the world rather than having occasional references to some broader picture in the midst of how the world impacts one specific group. It forces you to do more detailed and connected world building. I can tell you how the elves view the giants and how the giants view themselves in Lorwyn. Conversely, in Eldraine, a somewhat spiritual successor to Lorwyn, I couldn't tell you how even the Elven Queen of Lochwain views the Giant Lord of Garenbrig, because every non-human, non-planeswalker part of this world is exclusively shown to the audience through how it impacts individual humans and human society as a whole. Why was the decision made early on to not include humans in this world? Was there any reason for doing so other than, as you said on your episode on the Drive to Work podcast with Mark Rosewater, it being a unique selling point? Was there any other reason that the design team had for not including humans?
Uniqueness was a huge part of it. We wanted it to, like, humans had been a part of every setting we've done so far. Why not try one without them?
This is Aaron Forsyth, who I mentioned previously, the lead designer on Lorwyn, who has taken time out of his busy schedule running the International Space Station, apparently, to come on this channel and answer some questions about the sets.
I think that was fine. I mean, it did prevent us from having a great POV character, because everything was kind of new and weird in many ways. The bigger change that was part of, or the biggest decision around the set, was nothing was in the set that wasn't one of the 8 creature types. There was no creature in the entire set that was anything else. So that it precludes that kind of rule that I think was a handshake between design and creative, prevented us from making any dragons, insects, any other kind of texture things, because we wanted so badly to turn the creature type matters gameplay up as far as possible, and anything that did not fall into one of the buckets, I think would have been disappointing to players. So I think that hemmed in the world building quite a bit.
Anyway, back to the tribes that are in Lorwyn, and starting off we have the Kithkin. Kithkin is a creature type which had appeared on only a handful of cards before Lorwyn, and all but one of those cards came from Time Spiral Block, the set which immediately preceded Lorwyn. On the surface, these funny little folk seem to be pretty standard halfling or hobbit stand-ins, right down to their quaint little settlements and their penchant for taking on foes twice their size. That's not how you... Just say penchant, you fucking dork. But the introduction of the Thought Weft, a psychic connection all Kithkin share with each other, elevates this tribe above being a simple reskin of a fantasy archetype. Surge of Thought Weft describes the basis of this ability.
Kithkin weave together their very thoughts, creating a depth of cooperation unknown to other races.
Whereas Kithkin Healer showcases how it's used by the Kithkin of Lorwyn.
The empathic nature of the Thought Weft allows Kithkin healers to treat the cause of an illness rather than fight its symptoms.
This mystical cooperation and empathy gives a unique character to the community of Kithkin. Not only do their settlements band together a lot more readily, but other tribes of Lorwyn are far more likely to cooperate with the Kithkin than they are to fight them. Even their name, Kithkin, derived from kith and kin, an old-fashioned way of saying friends and family, extols their community spirit. Frankly, Kithkin is fully up there with orcs for me as a genuinely perfect name for a modern fantasy race which just oozes with appropriate imagery. Shapeshifters as well, previously only ever individual creatures and doppelgangers, were given a whole society of inquisitive, glassy beings to reflect the world of Lorwyn back onto itself, becoming beasts, mimicries of other tribes, or even taking on the form of ideas, memories, and fears. These changeling came with their very own changeling mechanic, which has made a return in a number of other sets, giving creatures that have it all creature types. Not only is this deliciously flavourful, mechanically letting shapeshifters indeed be all things at once, but it was also a huge boon to the Tribal Matters theme of Lorwyn deck construction.
Unlike Onslaught, which had some species like birds and goblins, but also some jobs like clerics and soldiers and wizards, and then zombie, which could be applied to just about any of it. Like you could have individual cards that were multiple types. So you could have a bird zombie or a bird wizard or a bird cleric, and it could go in any number of decks, and that made drafting really dynamic and made the cards useful in a variety of different constructed decks. When we set up Lorwyn, it was like there are 8 different species. There are no creatures that are 2 of these. There's no card that represents a goblin merfolk. And we quickly realized, well, this is not going to play well in limited. You're going to be all of one or all of the other, and if you get some of each, they're never going to complement one another. How do we make cards that let you pivot or combine or whatever? And that's when Brady said, well, changelings are a big part of Celtic folklore. I bet those could do some work. And we, the Mistform Ultimus was the prototype for those cards, so we already had that in our back pocket, and that just turned out terrifically. So I'd say that was probably the biggest input from the creative world building perspective, but it was a huge one.
Classic tribes also got a whole new makeover in Lorwyn in ways that either stand out as entirely unique to this world, or which went on to inspire the future designs of that tribe. Merfolk, who up until this point in Magic had been a combination of either Atlantean-esque schemers aloof from the rest of society, or the traditional monstrous drowners of seamen, were reimagined for Lorwyn. Here, they are far more connected to the world, trading in goods and rumours and frolicking around in deep rivers as opposed to the depths of the sea. We're even given the far more quaint name of Merrow in this world, in keeping with the absolute tweeness we talked about earlier. This rendition of them as more than just disconnected plotters of the ocean certainly laid the foundation for how merfolk were presented in future Magic sets, from Zendikar and Return to Ravnica to Ixalan and Strixhaven. It's also very interesting to note that before Lorwyn's printing, merfolk as a creature type were in a spot of danger within Magic's design space.
So there was a period in time where the creative team, they didn't like merfolk, like they're like, they live in water, we fight on land, this is just sort of weird. And so there's a period of time where they tried to take merfolk out of the game. And that was during Onslaught. And so the tribal set didn't have merfolk in it. And so when we came back and did the next tribal set, we're like, we have to like reclaim merfolk, and we had to get like we knew that merfolk was very popular. And so I know we brought merfolk back specifically so that we can sort of give them a tribal outing that they hadn't had before.
Personally, I think it's very fitting that the largest advocate of merfolk in Magic has a merfolk commander deck with Sig at its helm. After all, without the set that he is from, merfolk may well have left this game completely. Elementals also got a full makeover. Not only with the Flamekin, who, outside of a handful of previous humanoid depictions, were the first time elementals had been drawn as anything other than roiling masses of natural forces, but the fantastical menagerie of beasts who embody the chaos of Lorwyn's natural magic are endlessly iconic. Lorwyn's got it all. You got your gigantic ladybirds, you got your vape lizards, you got your Little Big Planet meets Garden of Earthly Delights looking motherfuckers. It's beautiful. These are, I would go so far as to say, the most unique interpretation of a previous creature type that has ever existed in any of Magic the Gathering's worlds.
Hey Marco, what are we gonna do about the zombies on Amonkhet?
Oh, I was gonna make them Hollywood-style mummies.
Great stuff. Chloe, what's the artist brief for Icoria's Nightmares gonna be?
I've told the artists to draw a bunch of tentacles, spikes, and or skulls on normal animals. Is that okay?
Brilliant job. Hey Omar, how are we doing with Lorwyn's Elemental? Hey Omar, have I ever expressed how fearful I am of the fact you know where I live?
Elves and goblins also received very fresh depictions, and, at least from my perspective, these renditions of traditional fantasy goobers are some of the most interesting versions of their respective tribes. Beginning with goblins, my best friends, my good time boys, my slice of apple pie, whilst most worlds depict goblins as either schemers or rabid animals or an entire culture doomed to be the punchline of a cosmic slapstick routine, Lorwyn gives us a wholly unique take on our little green friends by going against their usual selfish or at least thoughtless attitudes. The goblins on Lorwyn, or Boggarts as they're called there, come in a range of different colours, sizes and even basic physiologies. No two Boggarts on Lorwyn are the same, with some being little balls of chaos, others being antelope-looking weirdos, and yet others looking exactly like your mum. Very rarely do non-human creatures on Magic's planes have the kind of physical diversity as Lorwyn's Boggarts do, especially when it came to this point in Magic's history. But on top of that, whilst the Boggarts of Lorwyn do act as the agents of chaos that most goblins tend to be, the motive behind their rascally nature is so much more interesting and wholesome than other goblins. Whilst the Mogs of Wrath are motivated by stupid rage, and the Goblins of Mirrodin by their desire to feed the Furnace Goddess, and most other goblins by just whatever happens to be in their head at the time, the Boggarts of Lorwyn are motivated by the pursuit of experiences and the sharing of those experiences with each other. Sounds, smells, tastes, all three and more at the same time are treasured by and shared amongst Boggarts. Whilst this often sets them at odds with the rest of Lorwyn who would prefer their cutlery unstolen and their pies unpinched, the actions of Lorwyn's Boggarts are for the benefit of all Boggart kind and anyone who wants to get involved with the festivities. Indeed, as the flavour of Exiled Boggart describes.
Among the Boggarts, there is only one real rule. All new treasures and experiences must be shared. Those who hoard their gifts commit the one truly unforgivable sin.
Which does mean that Lorwyn's Boggarts are the most hardcore communists of all of Magic's canon. On the topic of this card specifically as well, there's a 2-act story told through it and one other piece. Beginning with Hoarder's Greed, which draws you alone cards, causes life loss, and which also has the chance to repeat forever if you keep winning clashes, potentially ruining your game and leaving you destitute and sad, like Exiled Boggart, Pete Venter's least sexy goblin. Moving away from goblins, my short kings, my rotten soldiers, my cream surprise, what? Elves also received both an aesthetic and ideological rework in this world, in that they were given horns, hooves, and turned into fascists. The elves of Magic's previous canon all struck very similar notes. No matter what world you found them on, standard fantasy, apocalyptic weapon planet, robot land, Enlightenment era Coruscant, elves were always militant stewards of nature, either fighting against industrial or military forces which encroach upon nature, or embracing technology to the direct proliferation or enhancement of nature. Whilst Lorwyn's elves plainly do still live in forests and the foundation of their power lies in the natural world, their political position in Lorwyn lies in stark contrast to the rest of the multiverse's elves up until this point. They could, frankly, give a toss about any aspect of the natural world that doesn't either conform to their ideology or that they can't tactically exploit as a beast for battle or plant for poison. Looking at the flavor text for Ambassador Oak as an example of how, even when the goals of elves and non-elves align, elves still hold themselves as above their cooperators.
Treefolk and elves share a common interest in the forests, but really, the elves just feel at home with the view from above.
Rather than voices and fists for a natural world under some kind of threat, Lorwyn's elves are expansionist beauty fascists. They have strict castes within their society organised quite literally by prettiness.
The faultless and immaculate castes form the lower tiers of elf society, with the exquisite caste above them. At the pinnacle is the perfect, a consummate blend of aristocrat and predator.
When your society's lowest caste is called the faultless, you truly have some messed up beauty standards. Somebody get these bastards a positivity body fuck! No, you know what? That's the third time I've tried to do that line, and it's not funny enough for me to try a fourth time. It's a mediocre joke. I'm done. You know what? I'm done. I've been recording for like an hour at this point. I'm gonna go and have a fucking snack. Of course, whilst faultless is the lowest socially acceptable caste within elf society, there is a rung lower, reserved for both social outcasts and every non-elf being. Eyeblights is the semi-slur reserved for elves who have been disfigured in some way, and for anything that isn't an elf. To elf society, eyeblights are beings unworthy of elvish attention, if even being worthy of life itself, and are often hunted for sport or used as battlefield fodder, willingly or not. Eyeblights are often caught and purposefully entangled in nettlevine, a kind of parasitic plant that slowly kills those who become caught in it and leaves them as semi-hypnotized husks, pawns for their elvish packmasters. Becoming a vinebred in this way is the only acceptable way for non-elves and for elves that have been scarred to continue to be part of elf society. Beauty is so intrinsic to the survival of elves in their society that non-lethal assassins called Scarblades can be hired to kill an elf by simply scarring their face or breaking a horn, rendering their victim instantaneously dead to society at large, as Pack's disdain shows.
Like the sun to a flower, the adoring gaze of the tribe is sustenance to an elf. To be shunned is to wither.
Elves are, quite clearly, the central foil to Lorwyn's peace and jolliness, one of the few times in Magic's history where a green-centred tribe has been positioned as the antagonists of a world. Remember when we talked about those few examples of genuine threat in Lorwyn's cards? Well, what's very important to note is that the vast majority of cards in this world that go against the plane's quiet whimsy are associated with elves. Coordinated Barrage, Hunter of Eyeblights, Warren Scourge Elf, Hunt Down, Eyeblight's Ending, all pieces which depict violence that's far from the arguable slapstick of Brian Stoutarm or the daintiness of Peppersmoke. Warren Scourge is an especially macabre scene, with the smouldering ruins of a Boggart Warren silhouetted against a setting sun, the corpses of dozens of slain goblins lying half submerged in muck, a stark reminder of both the supremacist contempt elves have for other tribes and their unwillingness to even cooperate with the aesthetics of the world around them, standing in contrast of a sunlit and jolly world, as this elf stands in contrast against a bloody scene with a sun setting behind them. Oh, look at me reading things into art.
Ooh, I could have a degree in this, I could. I'm quite good at it, ain't it?
Much like how Lorwyn's goblins were given a unique and tangible motive to their traditional chaotic behaviour, the arrogance and militarism of elves being justified by Sigma male ass hotness ratings leaves both tribes standing out against a sea of otherwise only somewhat differently shaded versions of the same thing. Not every creature type in Lorwyn got a unique spin on their traditional depictions, however. Treefolk and fairies in particular stick out as the most by-the-numbers versions of their respective creature types, with the former being wise pillars of the natural world who can go toe-to-toe with even the meanest giant, and the latter being sneaky little fucking bastards. But even then, Lorwyn gave these beings some kind of representation that had been lacking to them before in Magic. Lorwyn and Morningtide alone doubled the number of unique treefolk and fairy cards that had existed in Magic before the set's printing, and gave both a mechanical identity that had been lacking to the tribe beforehand. Say nothing of the lords, tutors, and other cards that cemented both as creature types that could be viable options to play in tribal decks. Toughness matters and toughness as combat damage mechanics were introduced into this set and have gone on to define treefolk as a tribe for almost 2 decades since. Fairies, in contrast, had less of a long-lasting mechanical impact, and whilst their representation here very much falls into the traditional realm of tricksy pranksters, their significance to the actual narrative and how their representation ties into the themes of Lorwyn still cemented them as one of the most iconic creature types of the plane. But before we talk about that theme and the actual narrative in great detail, I want to point out how iconic and beloved each of these representations of creature types are. Magic designers often struggle to make reimaginings of singular creature types land as well as their originals in even non-tribal focused sets. The humanoid slivers and capennacephalid designs spring to mind, although personally I like the latter's reimagining. Lorwyn fundamentally overhauled most of the creature types of its world, both physically and socially, and did so without a single miss. Each one was a massive risk, but without those risks, merfolk may well have been cut from the game entirely, goblins may well have never been presented as anything other than pointy green troublemakers in every other plane, and the entire Magic community may well have continued to promote disgusting elf apologia as if they weren't the true villains of every fantasy narrative they appear in. Now, we've dissected the individual representations of specific tribes as they appear in Lorwyn, but fun and fresh takes on fantasy archetypes is only a small part of the brilliant world building that makes Lorwyn feel like... Oh yeah, Lorwyn also had giants. I forgot to talk about them completely, and if I'm being honest, it kind of has to do with them being maybe the most forgettable of all of Lorwyn's tribes. Whilst most of Lorwyn's creature types either had very fresh aesthetic depictions or a unique mechanical identity, or both, giants in Lorwyn are kind of a patchwork of sometimes contradictory images. Whilst this does demonstrate a certain complexity with lumbering fools beside very put-together warrior sages, their lack of any kind of unifying imagery beyond being rather large does lead them to feel less defined as a result, especially in contrast to Lorwyn's other creature types. Their mechanics as well are less defined. The live fast die smelly character of the Goblins comes through in their proclivity to self-sacrifice mechanics, and the toughness matters treefolk feel sturdy and everlasting as a result. Giants, by contrast, have kind of a life gain sub-theme, and also cards which benefit from only having one big creature on your side of the board, but also cards which benefit from having multiple giants, and also cards which benefit from having lots of small non-giant creatures, but also cards which directly kill small non-giant creatures regardless of if you control them or not. Like, if you were to ask anybody who was even passingly aware of what Lorwyn was about to describe Kithkin, you'd probably get very similar and very quick answers. If you were to ask those same people to describe what Lorwyn's giants are like, you'd probably get a whole ream of contradictions. Again, great for displaying a certain degree of complexity within a non-human society on a new world, Not so good for creating an iconic creature type, however. Lorwyn's depiction of giants, for me, are by no means a dud. However, if we are being fair and critical, there had to be one of Lorwyn's 8 creature types which wasn't as good as the rest. I just think that giants didn't so easily need to be the one that won this dubious award. Anyway, now that I've saved myself from what would have been a probably cataclysmic amount of comments demanding to know where my description of giants went, we can finally get on to learning more about why Lorwyn feels like a living world that's alive and living with life. Lorwyn feels like a living, breathing world in a way that many Magic sets, particularly newer ones, really struggle to replicate. Just by scanning some of the cards in this set, a large amount of them feel like windows into a world that's going on without you. Merfolk trade with Kithkin, elves hunt flamekin, goblins give each other truly weird hairdos, say nothing of the micro-narratives that go on between cards like Hoarder's Greed and Exiled Boggart. Even the very landscape feels in motion, thanks to artists like Martiana Pilsarova, whose fine, soft brushstrokes bring the grass of this cliff base alive with the sway of a gentle breeze, carrying that motion through with the very cracks and crevices of the hard stone itself. But returning to the non-land art of this world, one thing that makes it feel so alive is the sheer amount of activity, interaction, cooperation, and conflict on the cards of this set. It may seem obvious, but showing an audience a world with people in motion with each other is a massive step in creating a world that feels like it's moving. And with Magic, the way to sell that feeling of movement to the majority of players is through card art. Out of curiosity, I went through and counted each piece of Lorwyn's art which depicts some kind of interaction between the people of this plane, made candid to you, the audience. I also split them between collaborative and hostile interactions between the same and different kinds of creatures for reasons I'll get into later. What I found was that of Lorwyn's 301 cards, 22 showed different kinds of beings in some kind of hostile interaction, with 11 of the same species in hostile scenes as well, mid-battle, playing harmful pranks, or otherwise purposefully threatened by one another, whereas conversely, 27 cards showed different kinds of beings in non-hostile scenes, and 41 showed the same kinds of people also in non-hostile scenes, trading, talking, being curious of one another, etc. This means that 100 cards, a near perfect third of this set, shows the people and beings of this world doing things with each other in this world. What this has the effect of is demonstrating Lorwyn is in motion, its communities thriving and faltering. The importance of the creatures who embody this motion is also mirrored in the mechanics of Lorwyn and Morningtide. There was a heavy focus on tribal synergies in this set, and we've already touched on the wealth of tutors, lords, and synergistic cards present, but there was also the champion mechanic, which acted as an upgrade for one creature that you had on your side of the board of one specific creature type, the kinship mechanic, which had you looking at the top card of your library, and if that card shared a type with the card that had kinship, you got some kind of benefit, and the prowl mechanic, which synergized amazingly with rogues attacking and dealing damage to your opponent. All of which encouraged you to fill your deck with creatures of a specific type, even if those creatures were different types in different ways. A Goblin and Fairy Prowl deck, for example, were linked by the prevalence of the rogue creature type amongst their cards, the necessary component to making the prowl mechanic function. Even non-creature spells became extra synergistic with tribal decks thanks to the tribal type, which was first teased in the Future Border a year before Lorwyn came out. This was a mechanic dripping with flavour. Lingify, being a treefolk enchantment, meant that effects which destroyed treefolk could also, very fittingly, undo the wooden petrification of anyone affected by their magic. Fodder Launch is a removal spell which narratively suggests you turn a goblin into goo and throw it at someone, mechanically reflected in the fact that the spell itself is still a goblin, even in this very squishy and grim state. But it's not just Anthem effects and tribal set mechanics which supported Lorwyn's many different creature types in gameplay. There are a whole host of individual cards which encouraged tribal synergies, and crucially, they were often cards which aided tribes outside of their own. And it's this decision and these cards, for me, which really sold the living interconnectedness of the plane. Cloudgoat Ranger is a very iconic card from Lorwyn, as well as being an utter house in Modern Masters Limited. This is a giant, which produces 3 Kithkin tokens and can gain flying when you tap 3 untapped Kithkin you control, thus benefiting a Kithkin deck which may be able to bump up the mass of tokens and being benefited by a Kithkin deck as well. The other side of this coin can be seen in cards like Boggart Loggers, which not only features Nib and Geek, some of Magic's most iconic goblins that everybody knows about, but also acts as hyper-specific creature type removal, destroying specifically treefolk and also very aptly forests. From a mechanical perspective, these cards really hammered home the creature types matters theme of both Lorwyn and Morningtide. It also, and this is purely a me thing, is the coolest shit ever when you counter somebody's play with a hyper-specific piece of removal or control magic. Destroy a Krenko with Murder and nobody bats an eye. Kill a Krenko with Tivadar of Thorn and everybody at the LGS feels like they're in the finals of EVO. But narratively, they do so much more. For one, they emphasise the cooperation and conflict between the different societies of Lorwyn. Kithkin and giants may be at odds on occasion, but they are also likely to work together for a common goal and good. In contrast, the relationship between goblins and treefolk is one far more fraught with mischief and ignorance, where the latter disregard boggarts as being beneath them in some way, and the former probably don't know how to tell trees and treefolk apart in the first place. They also made Lorwyn deck lists, particularly in Limited, feel representative of a broad side of the world rather than a narrow slice of it. Contrasted to a set like Innistrad, where your blue-black zombie deck would only run non-zombie cards if they were either bombs in of themselves or if your list was low on synergistic creatures, Lorwyn had giants which benefited Kithkin, Kithkin which benefited elves, and elves that benefited from giants. Rather than being mechanically isolated from one another, the tribes of Lorwyn always had some connection to one another, even if it was exclusively negative. And I feel like the narrative these mechanics tell could be learned from in future Magic worlds. It's really interesting design space to ask the question, how can we show mechanically the ways these two societies and peoples interact and view each other, rather than simply having creature-specific removal or the cost of one tribe being reduced by a card from another. If you even represent narrative conflict or cooperation through mechanics at all. Again, to disparage Eldraine, as is my wont, I'd challenge anybody to find me a single card in that set which captures the relationship between two non-human tribes anywhere near as well as Lowland Oath demonstrates both the character of giants, goblins, and how the two relate to each other in Lorwyn. Alright, just to make sure that I wasn't setting myself up for like a massive slam dunking once this video goes out, I did go back into Eldraine to see if I can find any examples of like, you know, two non-human tribes, neither of which are animals, sort of interacting with each other, that sort of tells you about how those two societies view each other. And I realised there's literally only one card, at least this is what I think, there's only one card in the entire of the set of Eldraine which shows two non-human, non-animal creatures interacting with each other, and it's ironically on the card Improbable Alliance, which showcases a dwarf holding a lantern that has a fairy in it. But this doesn't tell us anything about how the dwarves view the fairies, only that this alliance is improbable, that this specific way that the two creatures are interacting with each other is not the norm. So the only time that Eldraine deigns to tell us how two non-humans view each other is through the lens of, oh, isn't this a bit weird? Which is so unbelievably unhelpful from a world-building perspective. How the fuck do the dwarves and the fairies usually work together then? Do they at all? Like, I think this goes to show that lessons from Lorwyn's world-building, how the world is presented both in the art and the mechanics, lessons can absolutely still be learned from this set, even to this day. Whatever the quality of a Magic world, be it light-hearted, grim, extreme, or mundane, the way to awaken it as a living thing is to show how the people and creatures that inhabit it actually live amongst each other. I was curious, however, to see what happened when I took a world in Magic that didn't grab me as a living entity and analyse it through the same parameters as I'm analysing Lorwyn. Kamigawa Neon Dynasty is a triumph as far as a world revisitation goes, deftly succeeding at bringing one of Magic's most clowned upon realms up from the depths of mockery and energising it as a wholly new reality. It also, very helpfully for the purposes of this comparison, contains almost the exact same amount of cards as the original Lorwyn set did. However, I've never quite shaken the feeling that new Kamigawa feels less like a world whose streets I could imagine walking, and more like a showcase for world building ideas. Less a city high street, and more the town planning committee's marketing material for a city high street, albeit a very zhuzhy one. Now, it would be unfair to fully contrast Lorwyn to Neon Kamigawa. One is a tribal-focused set with 8 different relevant creature types, 14 if you count the class creature types that Morningtide cared about, whereas Neon Kamigawa cares about 6 creature types overall, although that is deceptive. Ninjas and rogues, for example, are treated as mechanically synonymous with each other. There's none of the overlapping between disconnected tribes that you'd find in Lorwyn, and none of the snake, fox, goblin, or even spirit tribes have any kind of mechanical support in Neon Dynasty. Obviously, Neon Dynasty is trying to mechanically focus on something different from its predecessors, and thank God for that, but it does leave the various communities and societies within its world feeling a lot less defined as a result. On an aesthetic level as well, when I applied my art test to this world, art test, TM, I noticed immediately that I was recording far fewer results in all tables. Different people interacted in hostile and non-hostile ways 18 and 15 times in Neon Dynasty's artwork respectively, and people of the same tribe interacted in hostile and non-hostile ways only 4 and 14 times respectively, totaling to just over 50 cards, a little under 17% of all the cards in this set. Compared to Lorwyn's numbers, the difference, particularly when it came to creatures of the same tribe interacting, is staggering. At least from my perspective, this has the effect of atomizing the residents of this world into disconnected individuals who, if they do get together, are most likely to fight those different to themselves rather than do anything else. Obviously, a test like this cooked up in, I kid you not, maybe 2.5 minutes, is far from the be-all and end-all of world building, but I wager it certainly contributes to New Kamigawa feeling less like a world in motion and more like a town in a Bethesda game where only 2 of the 12 residents were given any dialogue beyond "good day to you" and "my shoulder ape is missing, please help." I mean, there is the argument that this loss of community in Neon Dynasty is actually a clever comment about how the capitalist system of the modern era fractures the community into the individual, how under neoliberalism, with the enclosure of the commons, the decline of trade unionism, and with the exporting of mass industry from the imperial core to the imperial periphery, the material basis of community building has been uprooted and itself commodified, becoming ever more the exclusive purview of entertainment fandoms rather than neighborhoods and workplaces, that the culture of those once at odds or oppressed by the dominant socioeconomic ethnic group has been integrated in such a way that leaves only the people and traits deemed acceptable to that dominant culture intact, dissolving much of what made those cultures and nations themselves to begin with. All that is solid melts into air, all that is sacred is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. But that might be a bit of a reach. Additionally, a non-insignificant number of all of these pieces of art which depict people interacting were taken from artwork depicting the planeswalkers of the story assisting or fighting one another, not the everyday people of the world. This is another issue when it comes to the world building in contemporary Magic, and something that Lorwyn never had to contend with. Most of Magic's worlds, arguably up to Odyssey and then from Alara onwards, have been differently coloured backdrops for Planeswalker characters to do their own stuff in, and even then, all but Lorwyn were sets whose narratives were first incited by some kind of Planeswalker tomfuckery. Lorwyn's narrative is fully divorced from the multiverse. Yes, there are Planeswalker cards, but there's no mention of Jace or Liliana in the books or in flavor text. Indeed, Nissa's journey to Lorwyn, which was portrayed back in Magic Origins, which came out many years after the original set, had her turn up, get recruited into an elf murder party, and peace out just as the main twist of the world revealed itself. Every new setting in Magic, unless it's attached to a supplemental product such as Battle Bond, or set in a non-canonical fictional world like the Forgotten Realms or Indiana, always plays second fiddle to the narrative of Planeswalkers. Not only does this lead to worlds feeling less fleshed out by virtue of having to share the majority of the spotlight with extra-dimensional meddling pricks, but it also makes every world feel insignificant in comparison. What does it matter that there's a serial killer in New Capenna? The Phyrexian multiplanar invasion is nigh, and Elspeth needs to buy a new stick to intimidate Elish Norn with. By being fully divorced from this grand narrative, Lorwyn's conflicts feel less insignificant and more personal. You actually give a damn that Smick has been bound to the servitude of pointy-eared Mussolini and hope he gets out. A random Kithkin being brained with a fish on a brick has a lot more of an impact in comparison to any number of mass tragedies when they're always contrasted against some bigger picture. Speaking of the narrative, it would help if I fucking could say words, that would be a great start to a fucking YouTube career. Speaking of the narrative, Lorwyn's is, well, it's not exactly Pratchett, but it's certainly a lot better than it ought to be for a card game tie-in novel. Okay, so originally I planned to put a synopsis of the two books, Lorwyn and Morningtide, here, but what happens in the narrative of the set isn't nearly as important as how that story is told. For the record though, the long and short of it is, one of the elf racists blows up his own horns and learns to make friends with a bunch of other eyeblights whilst a big tree fucks them and continues to be a nuisance even after being set on fire and the world ending. It's a simple narrative with just the right balance of small-scale conflicts, such as Ashling's personal and internal fight with the elemental that caused her to blow up Colfanor, and overarching conspiracy, like the Fey Queen Una's machinations with the supposed elf Morrilan behind the scenes. This video is long enough as it is without me doing an actual Sparksnote version of Lorwyn and Morningtide story, but if you are really interested to find out exactly what happens, I'd highly recommend going over to Magic Untapped's YouTube channel. They've got 2 videos on Lorwyn and Morningtide stories, super easy and accessible synopses, and also a little bit about like the mechanics of the sets as well. Highly recommend you go check them out. They're collectively a lot fucking shorter than this piece of shit. But from a literary point of view, these books aren't masterpieces. There are plot threads that never get tied up, important characters die off screen, all of the books are rather long, and I really do appreciate the more condensed storytelling of the Magic the Gathering I started playing with, but the lack of any multiversal bigger picture, any Planeswalker A-plot that overshadows the lives of everyone else in this narrative was so refreshing to read. The whole story is like catching your breath. You don't need to know who Urza or Ajani or even what Magic the Gathering is to enjoy these books. Like, the closest that Magic has come to a break from the action-style story since Lorwyn was probably Eldraine. But even then, that mostly self-contained world could only really be fully appreciated and understood if you knew what the Chain Veil was and all that gubbins. And even then, the entire point of this narrative was to set up a potential future villain, tie up an old story thread, and give us an origin story for 2 new Planeswalkers. And that's it. There's no other point other than to just feed into potential future products, Marvel Cinematic Universe style. It's exhausting. I'm sorry that I'm realizing now at this point that this Why I Love Lorwyn video has become a dunking on Eldraine, but fuck it, you get what you pay for with Spice 8 Rack. And seeing as 98% of you don't pay me anything, I hope you enjoy your delicious free slop. I don't mind the existence of a narrative device that connects otherwise entirely disparate worlds like Planeswalkers do, but having read a lot of Magic stories before I got stuck into Lorwyn, I really feel like this does represent one of the few times in Magic that a world felt truly explored, rather than a place vacationed in by a Planeswalker or two. Lorwyn's narrative exclusively follows and is viewed through the eyes of the inhabitants of the plane, and to me, this is a huge boon to the story's world building. Having a narrative which follows a motley crew of disparate characters through their world allows for far more instances of cultural explorations and varied perspectives which help to develop an interconnected and complex perspective on the world. There are no less than 11 points of view used in the first of Lorwyn's novels from almost all of the Plains tribes, and each has something new to discover about the world along with us, and has something only they know about the world to impart on their companions. It makes for incredibly natural exposition. In addition, the exclusion of planeswalkers from a narrative raises the stakes of that narrative tremendously. Right at the start of Lorwyn, for example, Aisling, along with a Kithkin family and the Vendilion clique, board a magical ferry made of shapewater guided by Sig and his apprentice, Duga. Halfway through their journey, a beast in the water ploughs into the craft, breaking it apart and scattering the passengers into a raging river. Had, for example, Nissa been on that ship, the drama of the moment would have been utterly neutered because we've seen that character conjure skyscraper-sized elementals before, so saving half a dozen or so creatures isn't a great feat at all. But no planeswalkers are here, and we don't yet know the limits of any of these characters' abilities. Sig, Aisling and the clique are probably safe in this as they're important enough characters to be on cards, but there are several characters also caught in this disaster who very much aren't. Here we find out what kind of characters our potential protagonists are, both in their powers and their morals. The scene ends with the passengers being saved by Aisling and Sig, with the Vendilion clique being browbeaten into assisting, but not before Dugach is swallowed whole by the beast that first crashed into the vessel. The further into the books you get after this, the more real each moment of tension is. I mentioned this in my video about which planeswalkers I think will be completed by Phyrexia, but many characters in Magic have plot armor by virtue of their connection to wider narratives. Nissa, again for example, still has unfinished business with Emrakul, so nothing can actually threaten her until she's finished that arc. But with no extra planar relevance, the fate of characters like Brigid or the Vendilion clique or Marilyn is always up in the air, and as such, the tension of the narrative is far more real. Also, get this from Morningtide, gender! The sapling found the hardest part of interacting with the creatures of flesh, fire, and bone was remembering the names. The newborn you did not even have one, would not feel the need for one for some time. She could not answer to Kolfanor. Kolfanor was a different tree entirely. The gender-specific pronoun she'd found herself stuck with was a result of the other's assumptions, not realizing that neither she nor her predecessor Kolfanor was male or female as they understood it. Yet she appeared to make the flesh folk more comfortable than the rather more appropriate it. Yeah, so sapling's an agender icon, turns out. What an completely unexpected delight that is. Like, I came out as genderqueer a couple of weeks before I started reading this book. I'd been genderqueer for longer, but I wanted to wait till Pride was done before I came out. It seemed very thematic, very appropriate. And after that, stumbling across a genuinely interesting meditation about how sex and gender would be viewed by a fantasy species such as a treefolk was such a delight and such an unexpected pleasure, especially coming from a 2008 fantasy story, the second book in a series of collectible card game tie-in novels. I mean, talk about diamonds in the rough. I feel especially validated, not only because I use it pronouns, but also because, like, I didn't know this about Lorwyn going into it. I had no idea about this aspect of the story whatsoever. And the fact that I already loved Lorwyn and then finding this specific fact about the narrative of it after the fact is... Oh, I was made to make this video at this point, I swears to you. Now, this video is about how much I love Lorwyn and Morningtide. But as anybody who is anybody in Magic knows, you can't talk about Lorwyn without talking about the other side of the coin.
You know, Brady Dommermuth, who was the creative lead at that time, was on the design team with us. And we were, I don't know if he was the one that came up with the kind of light-dark as the two elements of the two blocks adding together. But anyway, he kind of took that and mapped it onto what he was calling, the Seelie and the Unseelie courts of like Celtic, I don't know if mythology is the word, or fairy tales exactly, folklore, maybe.
Yeah, Celtic folklore.
That we were loosely influenced by. This was not like a big top-down set where we studied Celtic folklore and tried to bring all those characters to life or whatnot. It was just like more like, here's a tone, Celtic folklore, light and dark.
And we liked the idea that Lorwyn was kind of the nice set and Shadowmoor was the mean set. Like sort of the part of night and day was light it was not as scary as the nighttime and a little nicer. And the nighttime it got very freaky and scary.
Duality was the central, foundational theme of the Lorwyn design ethos. And as was planned, once every 12 years, something happens in the world of Lorwyn. The Great Aurora. A force so all-consuming that no faith, no magic, no walls or borders can stop it. It comes, it is inevitable, and it turns Lorwyn into Shadowmoor, where all that is good turns rotten, where all who had kindness in their heart feel nothing but mindless rage, where dusk and night settle upon a land which had once only ever known perpetual late afternoon sunlight. Even I have become a twisted inversion of myself. All my morals, my scruples and ideology have been replaced with evil, heartlessness, and capitalist incentivization. This video is sponsored by NordVPN. Sometimes it's not the ineffable whims of the Fae that can bring a tidal wave of misfortune crashing down upon you. Sometimes it's conspiring hackermen who prowl on public Wi-Fi, clashing with any poor fool who would bring their laptop to a cafe or bistro and attempt to access Google Chroma without protection. With NordVPN, however, the champion of online safety, you can reinforce your security. NordVPN offers even more ways to hide away your data from such snoopers, such as using NordVPN's threat protection feature, which can block malicious ads that otherwise would have triballful effects on your computer's health. You can also act as a geographical changeling, tricking location-sensitive sites into thinking you're in Finland. If you want. If that sounds like something that evokes kinship in you, then why not click the link in this video's description for a 2-year plan with a huge discount and 4 additional months for free. And with a 30-day money-back guarantee, should your decision wither, there is no risk in untapping your purchase of NordVPN. Once again, click that link in the description for my exclusive offer for a 2-year plan with a huge discount plus 4 additional months for free. I promise you, I'm telling you this information with the best of intentions. Retrace. I wasn't sure how to fit retrace in.
Released on the 2nd of May 2008, 3 months after Morningtide, Shadowmoor and later Eventide completed the 4-set block of Lorwyn and Shadowmoor, each set a reflection of the other in some way. Where Lorwyn had been inspired by the Twee aesthetics of the bedtime story versions of tales and myths, Shadowmoor was the flip side of that, as Rei Nakazawa wrote.
Fairy tales weren't always the light, innocent fare we think of today. Once they were warnings to children to behave properly or to observe cultural norms, and their tellers weren't afraid to use fear to get the point across. These were stories filled with horrible monsters, bloody death, and hideous fates. And these are the tales that contribute their atmosphere to Shadowmoor. This is the dark side of the fairy tale, the kind told by the appropriately named Brothers Grimm, filled with eyes glowing in the dark, slavering goblins, and night that never ends.
Narratively, when the Great Aurora sundered the plane of Lorwyn in a physical and metaphysical sense, almost everything changed. For one, lush green woodlands and well-kept meadows transformed into dark corridors of dead trees and misty long grass where anything could be lurking. The very forms of creatures also shifted, and their memories of what came before were completely erased. The goofy personalities and presentation of goblins became malicious and sharp. Once unified by difference under the singular banner of Boggart, goblins are now split into strict tribes and gangs. Boggarts raid settlements with barbaric glee, where hobgoblins form vicious prairie militia. Mighty Spriggans plunder the wilds, and redcaps...
I've never had to do this before. You have to understand how far it has gotten for me to say this. You're
goblins
covered in
blood,
and everyone's upset. I need you to...
Wart, the matriarch of Boggarts, once a caretaker who passed down sylvan wisdom, is now a brutal raid leader. Once she was drawn in a storybook style, now she is bulbous, just more realistic enough to become drenched in the uncanny. Even Nib and Greek, again some of Magic's most famous and well-beloved goblins, went from being tree-bothering bastards to scarecrow-bothering bastards. I mean, what a shift! And of course, it's not just goblins. All of Lorwyn's tribes went through some kind of inversion during the Great Aurora. The helpful ferrying Merrow became vicious pirates. Treefolk went from talkative peddlers of wisdom to run-out husks of a personified, dying world. And maybe, most tragically of all, the community-focused Kithkin became fierce isolationists, bound by the thought weft which now acts as their society's collective paranoia about the other.
The Kithkin mind bond is even tighter in Shadowmoor, reinforcing the unity of their community to the point of xenophobia.
Only elves had any kind of positive change in Shadowmoor, becoming ardent protectors of the needful and natural world, but hunted as a result by the very beings their original selves considered to be degenerate scum. The Fae, and a very small handful of characters in the narrative, remain unchanged. The latter via the protection of magical artifacts, the former due to their queen and mother Una being the architect of the Aurora's unseasonably swift arrival. I said before that the Fae's design in Lorwyn being highly traditional feeds into the theme of the whole block, and it's specifically because of how it aids the transition to, and comparison of, Lorwyn to Shadowmoor. On the most obvious point, having small glimpses of consistency between the worlds aids an audience to understand that they are indeed linked, and also creates an element which grounds our perception of this world through the lens of what came before. But the fact that the Fae remain unchanged also demonstrates an astute understanding of the traditional icon of fairies in the cultures that inspired Lorwyn and Shadowmoor. The Fae are always fickle and unpredictable elements in most of the traditional stories they appear in, offering riches with one hand whilst holding a dagger in the other. The same is with the Fae of Lorwyn, tricking giants, helping merfolk, playing with goblins, and enchanting Kithkin. The fact that Lorwyn's and Shadowmoor's Fae are consistent across both worlds is a reflection of this theme of duality. The Aurora changes everything except that which was already ever-changing.
Can you tell I have multiple degrees in creative writing yet? And Shadowmoor wasn't just a narrative inversion of Lorwyn, it was a mechanical one as well. The +1/+1 counters produced from mechanics such as Reinforce in Lorwyn were replaced with -1/-1 counters in Persist and Wither. The tap symbol was inverted into the untap symbol. Gold multicoloured cards became hybrid mana cards, and tribal synergies were entirely absent from both Shadowmoor and Eventide, instead being replaced with colour identity matters effects. A not so subtle way of demonstrating that the community focus of most of the plane's inhabitants had been replaced with something far less wholesome. Retrace as well could be seen as an inversion of Reinforce. Rather than discarding non-lands for counters, you discard lands to cast spells from your graveyard instead. Indeed, the graveyard became a far more important zone to consider in Shadowmoor and Eventide than it ever was in Lorwyn. And, you know, I'm a big Ludo narrative person, but I think, like, Magic the Gathering Ludo Narrative 101, if a set asks you to consider the graveyard as a zone more than usual, it's probably a bad place for you to be. Not a lot of good comes out of the graveyard. Also, you might notice that I haven't really talked about a lot of these mechanics in depth at this point, but don't worry, there's a reason for that, and we'll get onto it in the later chapters. And speaking of the lands that you might discard to retrace, fuck me, Shadowmoor has some of the bleakest and most genuinely terrifying vistas of any Magic set. The Plains, particularly. Compared with other worlds' attempts at unnerving vistas, Shadowmoor just knocks it out of the park. I'd willingly, but cautiously, have a wander through Titus Lunter's deserted Amonkhet Temple. I'd gladly have a jaunt, maybe even a picnic, in Young Park's desolate Innistradian Moor. But you couldn't pay me any money that would see me take even one step into the wheat field of Omar Ryan. If the monsters I know are hiding in the fog below the grassline don't get me, the gluten certainly would. Horror and comedy are two very alike genres, in that they rely on contrast and surprise to be most effective. The reason why the majority of the horror of every Innistrad set falls flat, in my opinion, is because it's more a series of tropes converted into cardstock than anything particularly unsettling. It's the greatest hits of a series of pieces of horror media that have long since lost any freshness. Shadowmoor, by contrast, takes everything wholesome and twee about Lorwyn and drowns it in grim, whilst also not relying on already common horror iconography. The uncanny warping of character designs and the twisting of their mechanics is both horrifying in of itself, but also creates a feeling of nostalgia and of longing for the quainter, prettier and kinder world that came before. Much in the same way that seeing the erstwhile Khans of Tarkir reduced to glorified head chefs and zombified advisors makes you sad for the loss of a world not ruled by immortal dragonlords, seeing the once jovial Sig transformed into a literal cutthroat makes the green grass of Lorwyn seem all that greener, and the dark moors of Shadowmoor all that more glutinous. In contrast to Lorwyn, the art of Shadowmoor as well has an isolating quality without making the world feel lifeless. Using that art test from earlier, we can see a significant change in how people of the same and different tribes are shown with each other. There are far more pieces of art that show more than one person in hostile scenes than non-hostile scenes, and there are only 3 pieces in the entire set which depict different creatures interacting in non-hostile ways. And even then, both Advice from the Fae and Beseech the Queen still have an air of menace, and you can be sure that if Somnomancer wasn't putting this giant to sleep, there would almost certainly be bloodshed. Returning to that idea that the Fae embody the Blocks theme of duality, I think it's no mistake that 2 of the 3 non-violent scenes between creature types in this set concern fairies, the only creature type whose behaviour operates in the same way between Lorwyn and Shadowmoor. See, it's clever. It's not lazy to make the Fae traditional depictions that don't change between the Auroras. It was a very clever decision. There are also fewer examples of artwork which shows more than one person generally as well. 20 pieces less than Lorwyn, certainly adding to an air of isolation in comparison to the bursting with community feel of the previous set, but still far more than the supposedly busy near-future metropolises of Kamigawa which we compared to earlier. The effect that this has, contrasted against Lorwyn but still retaining a significant amount of pieces of art that depicts interactions happening within the world, makes the world feel still alive and in motion, but those lives are simply hateful ones, and that motion is more often than not the arc of a dagger aimed at somebody else's back. And whilst the world may be moving with threats and villains, the landscape itself feels utterly hollowed out. Most of the art of Lorwyn and Morningtide's cards have detailed backgrounds. Gold medal stalwart's art, for example, draws your eye from the outraged giant to the subject of his indignation. All the while, your gaze travels over blue skies, rolling hills, distant trees, birds for scale, and even a farmstead tucked away in an unimportant side of the frame. The world is given depth here, both literally in that we can see really far into the distance, but also socially. The birds are doing their own thing, and there's an entire house probably full of people just sort of pootling along, all of which is completely unrelated to the main subject of action. By contrast, look to the art of Springjack Shepherd from Eventide. Here, the subjects are clear, a shepherd and her flock, but the environment they're placed in is abstract and dull. A field curves unnaturally away into distant hills that almost seem to float in a roiling sky of clouds which take up over half the picture's real estate. Thistles border the bottom of the frame with dark clouds above, sandwiching the Kithkin between shadows. Interestingly enough, this style is mirrored in only one Lorwyn card, Warren Scourge Elf, which I touched on before. Both scenes end at the horizon line and give way into a mess of clouds, the central character isolated in their hostility against the void beyond, drawing us to compare the violence of Lorwyn's elves to the implied violence of the new Kithkin's shepherds.
Better for Duin to lose its ken than its springjacks.
What steps is she willing to take to ensure that? And is that meant as a warning or a threat against the reader? To me, this compositional style is almost Goya-like, a 18th and 19th century Spanish painter most renowned for his late series of black paintings. We can see similarities in these pieces with Goya's 3rd of May, the scene of action painted in twisted detail and the rest of the world a void, its distant details unclear and set against a nightmarish sky. This isn't the only similarity I find in Shadowmoor and Goya. Kithkin rabbles' faces, full of anger and becoming less coherent as they move further away from the torch of the rabble-rouser, reminds me of the pilgrimage of San Isidro, how individuals become more a physical mesh in both respective mobs, how the implication of an even greater mass of people is implied only in abstract shapes, pitted against a warped environment. The pilgrimage of San Isidro itself is a warped reflection of Goya's earlier piece, The Meadow of San Isidro, painted 30 years prior, and well before Goya's traumatic experiences during the Peninsular War. Horror is nothing without contrasts. Goya's bleak, dehumanizing, impressionist interpretation of the crowds of San Isidro drips with deeper meaning only when contrasted with the idyll of Goya's past perception. Kithkin rabble is a terrifying mass of violent creatures, but the horror and tragedy of the piece only truly become apparent when it's contrasted against what came before. And inversely, the now lost peace and beauty of the former piece becomes even more poignant when compared to the darkness that follows. Okay, number one, I realised that I pronounced San Isidro like 3 different ways there. One of them must be correct. And also, me doing a Lorwyn, Shadowmoor and Francisco Goya bit is far too budget Rhystic Studies for me to continue. So here's a picture of Nikita Khrushchev being really excited about some corn with the NFL theme playing under it. Ah, there we go. We're in a Spice 8-rack video again. Something that occurred to me only after I finished writing this script was how the change from Lorwyn to Shadowmoor also changes the character of humanity's exclusion from both worlds. In Lorwyn, the lack of humans can be linked to other things the world lacks. Industry, city, societies with mass internal conflict, stuff like that. A kind of implied humans are the blight upon the world kind of vibe. Not something I agree with, mind you, but also not a message I feel the designers were consciously trying to send. We, as humans, observe the world without us with glee. Shadowmoor, on the other hand, makes us feel like strangers. Wanderers through a land where we are welcome nowhere. The eyes of the Kithkin stare out at us like the outsiders we are. Spiked, racked elementals reach out to break our bodies. Merfolk study the new creature in front of them, working out if we can breathe underwater or not. The lack of humanity, the lack of even creatures who look like us now that the Kithkin's eyes are unnatural pearl orbs, makes the viewer feel even more isolated, more trapped in a hostile world. But of course, Shadowmoor bears a far greater narrative significance to Lorwyn rather than simply being an inversion of it. The art and flavour of Reflecting Pool, one of the very few cards in any of the 4 sets to reference the effects of the Great Aurora, captures this feeling of a world lost forever. We see a cave lit only by firebugs and their reflections off of shining rocks embedded into the dull stone. A staircase hewn from the cave walls leads down to a pool of water which magically reflects a distorted but undeniable vision of the lush hills of Lorwyn. Whilst the stairs in the reflection dip over the hill and disappear into blue skies, the stairs of the cave above, the cave we are in, lead only to a dark passageway. The flavour reads,
"Does it reflect the future that once was, or the past that can never be?"
And this is more than just a random epithet. Lorwyn as we knew it can never be again. In what I can only describe as the ballsiest narrative move imaginable, the story team behind Lorwyn conclude all 4 novels by fusing Lorwyn and Shadowmoor together. Rather than a 12-year cycle between auroras where one becomes the other, now the plane cycles between day and night, with Lorwyn becoming Shadowmoor and vice versa once every 12 hours. Consider how much of a challenge this sets up for designers of the future. You have 2 realities where everything and everyone is some kind of inversion of themselves, which don't know that the other exist, and suddenly, because a giant ripped the Queen of Fairies in half, spoilers, now these 2 realities not only exist in the same world, but the world jumps between them every day, and everybody remembers who they are in both realities. How would you even go about beginning to unpick and reform the individual characters in that scenario, say nothing of the systems and structures and societies of the world as a whole? I feel like all of this may be one of the major reasons why I have such a feeling of nostalgia towards Lorwyn, despite never having played it. Because all of the aspects that I found and still find so endearing and interesting were first defined by their sudden and twisted inversion, and then lost to an entirely new and unseen world. I get it, you might say. Lorwyn good, Shadowmoor bad. Did this video really need to be over an hour long? And first off, no, but shut up anyway. But second, that's a very surface level approach to this world. For instance, a lot of the cruelty and pain seen in Shadowmoor, such as with tortures, -1/-1 counters, was actually first borne out in attempts to make nice removal for Lorwyn.
Initially, we were just talking about the level of removal should be really low, or removal should be really weak, because there's not a lot of killing going on in this world. Like, the goblins are throwing pies at each other, not stabbing each other. Mm-hmm. Boy, did we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to make a magic set where there wasn't where there was tons of creatures and not a lot of removal.
And so part of that was we were using -1/-1 counters with the flavor of, oh, you're not killing them, you're just injuring them. And then it just became apparent so quickly that it just felt meaner. It didn't feel nicer.
Viewing Shadowmoor as simply the Wario to Lorwyn's Mario obfuscates the more complicated understanding that neither are wholly good or evil. For example, when contrasted against the horror story levels of cruelty and violence on Shadowmoor, it's easy to forget the less frequent violence of Lorwyn's elves, but also the implied violence of the other people of the plane. The Kithkin, for example, are very often armed in their artwork, have border guards, weaponized airships, dedicated battle planners. The existence of armed knights, no matter how cute or goofy they may be, necessarily suggests a need or desire for armed cavalry. Remember when I said that the kind of conflict found in other planes is lacking in Lorwyn? Well, that's partly because a lot of Lorwyn's violence is only partially shown, either moments before the visceral reality of it is brought to fruition, or where the enactor or subject of violence is othered, presented off-screen. In a way, because Shadowmoor doesn't shy away from the realities of violence, letting the camera record for a second or two longer as it were, these sets are as much about duality as they are about perspective. To put it another way, De Goya's 3rd of May is just De Goya's boys playing soldiers plus time. Aha! I have successfully climbed inside my own arse. I hope that Lorwyn and Shadowmoor's inverted depictions of violence, how one is rendered meaningless or absent whilst the other actively tries to frighten us, gets further explored when these planes meld in a future set. A world where the entire population switches from good to evil and vice versa every day is brimming with potential for an interesting exploration of this topic. Even if it takes 5 years to return to the plane, I'm almost certainly fixing to write a video about manufactured consent through the lens of fantasy narratives and allegories. So thanks Lorwyn for adding yet another item to my engorged to-do list of video topics, you son of a bitch! Also, we only view Shadowmoor as an inversion of Lorwyn because one came first. Shadowmoor is also very much its own world and adds things that lacked from Lorwyn, not all of them being evil. The ever-delightful Noggle, humanoid donkeys with a penchant for public vandalism, based politics, and staring directly into your very soul from atop an ashen moor of a moonlit world. There's also the Hag, crones of the forests, grasslands and swamps of this world, either in the form of spell-weaving schemers or true icons of monstrous horror. There's also the Oofy, delightful... Wait. Oofy? No, I know the Oofy. I've seen them before. You're not real! You're not real! You're not real! No! Trolls don't exist in Lorwyn, but Mosswarp Bridge has been usurped by one in Shadowmoor, and a variety of smaller trolls also litter the land. That which exists in the world which isn't a twisted reflection of something that came before may have been floating on some unseen plane of Lorwyn, or, in the case of the dwarven Druaga, sleeping beneath the earth. Spirits, zombies, skeletons and avatars also make their presence known, feeding into the unavoidable atmosphere of death and the question of what lies beyond that permeates throughout all of Shadowmoor, a question never really given much thought even in the darkest moments of Lorwyn. But once again, that has less to do with death not being a reality on Lorwyn, and much more so the camera simply pointing the other way. Also, remember how I said that Lorwyn's ratio of whimsical to serious imagery favouring whimsy was the inverse of most of Magic the Gathering's worlds? How that was the more effective aesthetic ratio? Well, ratio this past me, because Shadowmoor demonstrates just how effective glimmers of dark in a light world can be. Gilda Bairn is serving over the garden hedge levels of tweeness in amongst the genuine terror of the rest of the world. A forest sprite wears a trick-or-treat costume of what could be a boggart or a frog and is leaving wee shining bugs on tree branches and tortoises. The innocence of this character as they leave these little gifts in the forest is both a moment of joy in an otherwise miserable world, but also enhances the terror of their surroundings. After all, we know what lives in these woods, and how long could such a wee thing survive if something decided to follow the trail? God damn! These fucking sets they're so cool! Why have we not returned to these?
However, and it really genuinely does pain me to say, however, despite me spending a frankly comical amount of word count singing the praises of these sets, this video has been framed as a defense, and unfortunately, not everything can be defended. There is a reason why Lorwyn and Shadowmoor have not been returned to for many years, why few of their mechanics have ever been revisited, and I can assure you that the reality of Lorwyn and Shadowmoor is not all rosy. Rosy water, if you will. Hey, fuck you! In the interests of being both fair and, I'd even go so far as to say balanced, not all of Lorwyn and Shadowmoor's aspects worked as well as they could have. Mechanically, there are a number of issues and duds between these 4 sets. Yes, this is the point of the video where I finally talk about most of the set's mechanics. Reinforce is deeply dull as a mechanic, letting you discard a card for its reinforced cost to put a number of +1/+1 counters on a creature equal to its reinforced number. It's fine as a combat trick and as a way of giving use to cards which would otherwise be dead draws in the late game, but fundamentally boring, especially in comparison to the otherwise whimsical world the mechanic was printed in. Clash was a far more interesting mechanic, but arguably also a far worse one. To clash, you look at the top card of your library, as does one of your opponents. Whoever reveals the card with the highest mana value wins, and then both players place their revealed card on either the top or the bottom of their libraries. If mana values are tied, nobody wins. This mechanic incentivized you to run many high mana value cards in your deck to more likely win clashes. The issue was that, on top of being highly unpredictable, this mechanic doesn't work nearly as well in Magic as in other TCGs, for the simple reason that a third of most decks are going to be made up of land which has a mana value of 0, meaning that no matter how you tried to stack your deck to win clashes, there's always a decent chance you'll instantly lose it anyway. Additionally, most cards with Clash, or for whom Clash mattered, exist at a mana value of 2 or less, meaning that the majority of cards a player may want to run if they enjoyed the Clash mechanic would actively work against the effects of Clash if revealed in a Clash. Additionally, most Clash cards that were printed were horribly balanced. Cards with Clash either had deeply boring effects, such as Adderstaff Boggart entering with or without a +1/+1 counter on it, depending on whether or not you won your Clash, or Clash gave the card it was printed on a huge downside, such as Captivating Glance's deeply fickle reskinning of Control Magic. Or the difference between winning and losing a Clash would fully turn the tables on an entire game, like how Pollen Lullaby would either be an expensive fog or leave your opponent wide open for 2 turns in a row. There's also the deeply funny fact that you can go infinite with Release the Ants and Omniscience, provided you can brainstorm something like a second copy of Omniscience to the top of your library. But that's completely beside the point. I just find it funny that a card called Release the Ants represents potentially infinite damage. Moving on to another mechanic, remember how I praised the tribal mechanic much earlier? Well, unfortunately, as flavourful as this mechanic was, its existence put far too great a strain on designers. If Crush Underfoot is a giant card, this mechanic said, why isn't Lingering Souls a spirit card? Why shouldn't Memorial to Genius have the dickhead who ruined everything subtype? Effectively, Tribal was such a flavour slam dunk that doing it as a full mechanic beyond a single set would have forced future Magic designers to constantly be debating the tribal legitimacy of every non-creature card ever printed, and so now it only very rarely appears on one card every few years where it really fits. Conspire was also another filler mechanic which actually kind of worked against the flavour of the world it was printed in. Theoretically, it was supposed to be the inverse of Lorwyn's Tribal Matters theme, caring about colour identity rather than creature type. But in doing so, it also conflicted with Shadowmoor's theme of isolationism between the peoples of this world. Only caring about a creature's colour identity allowed elves and goblins, for example, to work together in order to copy a spell's effect, weirdly making Lorwyn seem far more mechanically exclusionary in comparison.
Frankly, if you'd swapped Clash and Conspire around, you would have been able to make a far better narrative argument for their existence in each other's sets. Indeed, in an article published in late 2010, Mark Rosewater listed all of these mechanics, plus kinship and untapping, as the worst mechanics to exist in the then extended format. And as much as I feel that the untap symbol being a fun mirror of the tap symbol represented the duality of Lorwyn and Shadowmoor wonderfully, I wholly do agree that it's a confusing image for Magic players, old and new. I will die on the hill that kinship could be fun and good, though, especially now that Scry is an evergreen mechanic. Come at me, Mark. I'll slam you down big style. Thanks for contributing to and retweeting the Silver Border video I made, by the way. It improved it immensely, and it really meant a lot that you decided to be a part of it. Thank you. But even the stuff that many players, myself included, look back on positively, such as the heavy focus on tribal mechanics, had its own flaws. The complexity problems that Lorwyn and Morningtide Limited encountered, where cards affected and were affected by multiple tribes at the same time, has been cited as one of the things that led to Magic's, quote, new world order of games design, a design philosophy that is A, terribly named, and B, sought to more limit the complexity of most Magic cards as well as the impact they had on the board state. Having common cards which granted keywords to multiple distinct creature types may be great for demonstrating the interconnectedness of worlds, but it's also a nightmare for keeping track of, especially in limited environments where potentially dozens of unique cards grant each other unique benefits and drawbacks. Going back to when I criticised the way that Innistrad's design led to comparatively boring deck construction, especially in Limited, it may have been more narratively boring, but its mechanical simplicity certainly led to it being far better received in terms of gameplay, and thus also as a world as a result. This hypercomplexity was only made worse when Morningtide was released. Lorwyn's tribal mechanics focused on quote-unquote creature races, goblins, giants, elves, etc. Morningtide contained goblins, giants, and elves, but its mechanics now cared about class types as well: warriors, clerics, and shaman. Effectively, this edition at least doubled the amount of synergies you had to consider when building and playing limited decks of these two sets. Like, just to demonstrate how complex limited board states of Morningtide and Lorwyn could get, here are 4 cards that you might have on your side of the board. You want to play the card Rage Forger and then attack with everything you can. I challenge you to work out every relevant trigger and static ability you have to consider during those 2 ostensibly simple actions in less time it takes for me to go and make a cup of tea. I'm actually going to go do it. I'm going to go make a cup of tea. Work it out. Let me know in the comments. There we go. Oh, did you remember to factor in Changeling Hero's lifelink ability on the +1/+1 counter-attack trigger from Rage Forger? You did? Oh, I'm proud of you. Obviously, mechanics like Changeling, Evoke, Retrace, Hideaway, and Planeswalkers would make a return. Wither-inspired Infect, Persist-inspired Undying, Untapping-inspired, well, Inspire, and Devotion is just Chroma with the serial numbers filed off. But despite some champion mechanics, ironically not including champion, the many mechanical flops of Lorwyn and Shadowmoor were cited as major reasons that the sets were only tepidly received by the player base.
The mechanics were strange, and this may have also, this was probably more on the world building side. We were trying to make the world very non-violent, especially Lorwyn. Shadowmoor got a little turned darker and got amped up, but like, you know, people were hitting each other in the face with pies or whatever and not stabbing each other. And so we ended up with mechanics like Clash. They were trying to show like, oh, we're having a little slap fight or whatever, and not actually murdering each other in the streets. and it was pretty convoluted and weak, honestly. Reinforce, I think, is a fine utilitarian mechanic that could easily be used again. Kinship requires a density of creature type mattering that we just haven't really replicated since then, so that's a hard one to reuse. Evoke's cool. That one I'm definitely proud of. Hideaway's cool. That one I'm definitely proud of. So there was, I'd say more hits than misses on the keywords throughout the year. But the overall way they added up, in addition to the world building, something did not click with the vast majority of the audience. We were definitely in the mindset of like our games should be badass, and our target audience is like 14-year-old boys back then, and Lorwyn was just not that at all. And so it was fingers were pointed at that aspect of it a lot initially when it didn't do well. But I do think the gameplay complexity, which we've talked about to death, I know Mark talks about a lot, that led us to New World Order, turned off a good chunk of the audience.
Now, whilst 14-year-old me almost certainly would have preferred to play with Magic's darker, grittier, edgy worlds over Lorwyn, after all, 16-year-old me got into playing mono black in Magic because you could cast swarms of rats, I've certainly grown to embrace, rather than reject, the lighter and more twee aesthetic that most of my early escapism was drenched in. For example, 26-year-old me likes playing mono black in Magic because I get to cast swarms of rats. And whilst at the time Lorwyn's world may have been a detriment to its popularity, I have my doubts that the player base, and even both current and future demographics of teenage gamers, would so readily turn their noses up at a revisitation of such a cutesy world, especially one with a dark undercurrent. Mark it a return to Lorwyn and Shadowmoor with some Animal Crossing X Doom Eternal vibes, and whatever nanoplastic poisoned generation is coming after Zoomers will eat it up with a comically large spoon. However, this is very much not to say that there weren't glaring issues with Lorwyn's world and narrative. Very little of each character from the books come across in any aspect on their cards. Rhys, the central character of at least the first book, has mechanics which benefit elf tribal decks, despite the fact that after his whoopsie-doodle war crime, which also blew his horns off, his only interaction with elves outside of Marilyn is being hunted and attacked by them. Gaddock Teague as well is given this air of solemn importance, both with his hate bear mechanics and his flavour text, which paints him as a wise lawmaker.
So great is his wisdom and spirit that many who have met him say that they stood before a giant of a man and talked to the wisest of the four winds.
Whereas in the book, he's a self-serving and nervous oaf.
Teague's nerves were shot, so it was understandable, he would tell himself later, for him to scream like a Kithling girl when a nearby piece of shrubbery he'd assumed to be a new decorative addition pulled its roots from the ground and stepped into the street. Gaddock Teague screamed the scream he had inherited from his paternal grandmother. Gaddock Teague screamed the scream he had inherited from his paternal grandmother and leapt backwards nearly 3 feet, leaving an empty pair of sandals where he had previously stood.
Nothing quite says these books had two writers than a thoughtful meditation on how the concept of gender may be approached by a treefolk, coming from the same novel series as multiple scared man is like a girl gags. Additionally, many other legendary creatures in the set are either only referenced in passing or otherwise completely absent from any of Lorwyn's first 2 novels, whilst one of the most important characters in the entire narrative is only represented in the art and flavour text on Morningtide Disperse. Griffith is introduced to us right at the start of Lorwyn's novel, where he is Rhys's friend. However, after Rhys's horn explosion, he becomes deeply antagonistic towards the elf, even hunting him down. And this antagonism translates across both Lorwyn and Shadowmoor, with Shadowmoor's Griffith also hunting Rhys down for presumed treachery towards the elves of this world. This culminates with Griffith sacrificing himself in order to break one of Una's most powerful spells, which eventually leads to the destruction of Una and the fusing of Lorwyn and Shadowmoor. Griffith is one of the most important and complicated characters in the entire of Lorwyn and Shadowmoor, and the fact that this isn't represented in
any meaningful way throughout any of Lorwyn or Shadowmoor's products, I think speaks volumes for a lack of communication and coordination between design and narrative.
Design decided we wanted to have a legendary character for each of the main creature types. You mentioned Gaddock Teeg, there was Sig, there was Wart, there was Doran. Lots of cool characters. Some of those were things that the world building folks said, we think we want the main character to be this, or whichever one it would be. Think about that while you're making the card. The other ones, it was just like, they didn't care. We could make the card do whatever we wanted. And then what would happen is the creative text writers, which is the names and flavor text people, which are usually contracted external folks, coordinated by someone in the building. And then the novelist, who is another external person contracted to write this novel, were both given the same inputs, but they were both generating their material in parallel with one another. And sometimes those things did not line up. And oftentimes, by the time the novel got back to us, the card set was done. And, the novel deadline was looming. So, yeah, a little bit of left hand, right hand stuff going on at that time, where, just the need to get everything done on the schedule that we did, and different people coordinating different things. It was not as synced as, we would have loved it to be. And I think that's noticeable if you dig into the details. And but now we are much more in lockstep.
To me, these are the biggest tragedies of Lorwyn. That a deeply interesting and unique world was tied to a series of uninteresting or downright bad mechanics, which soured the player base's perception of it for years to come, and potentially, as a result, has now missed its chance to be revisited in the same way it was first introduced to us. However,
I'll say nothing other than every time we sit down to plan out another year's worth of sets, Lorwyn and Alara are both, on the list of things to consider. So they're certainly not forgotten.
Okay, obviously not really, but there is genuine hope for a return to this set, and I'd even go so far as to argue a precedent for it as well. The Rabia scale is the narrative equivalent to the Storm scale, a rating system that Mark Rosewater and other designers at Wizards use as a shorthand to describe how likely it is we'll see a mechanic return in a future set. A 10 means never, a 5 means an optimistic maybe, and a 1 means it's going to be back in the very next set, aka Evergreen. Both of these scales were named at the time for the highest scoring item on their respective tables. Storm being a busted mechanic that for some reason keeps getting printed on cards despite breaking at least one format each time it does, and Rabia being the 1001 Nights themed setting of the Arabian Nights set. Lorwyn and Shadowmoor currently jump between a 6 and a 7 on the Rabia scale, meaning that its return is at worst unlikely and at best an unoptimistic notion. However, the same was very much true for another world introduced only a few years before Lorwyn. Kamigawa suffered from a number of similar issues to Lorwyn. Complex and often lackluster mechanics, a potentially too heavy focus on niche tribal themes, and, as a result, for years Kamigawa sat between an 8 and a 7 on the Rabia scale, meaning that its return was at best unlikely and at worst only possible if the stars aligned. And, well, the stars aligned and then some, didn't they?
You never see it come back.
Kamigawa Neon Dynasty not only brought a world whose initial reception had been fraught at the best of times back, but did so with a bang, being heralded by Mark Rosewater as a home run, the best received set of 2022, and one that lived up to the excitement of the enfranchised players who had been calling for a return to the world for years. After this highly positive reception, Kamigawa now sits at the much more promising 4 on the Rabia scale, and gives me a boatload of hope for a return to Lorwyn. Whilst Neon Dynasty certainly represents a blueprint for how to revitalise an old plane, there are many things about how Lorwyn's world was built and displayed to us in its original sets that do work better in comparison to how Neon Kamigawa's world shaped out. The core of the mechanics which succeeded in demonstrating depth and interconnectedness in the world, and the fullness of the artwork of Lorwyn are things to absolutely hold on to when it comes to a revisitation. Even if the, we shall say, highly flavourful board state complexity is well in need of a pruning down. However, we can already see hints as to what a return to Lorwyn and Shadowmoor may look like in Magic already, and I'd argue it all rings rather positively. The few cards that have been printed since Lorwyn came out, which also depict the plane, such as Giltleaf Winnower, who destroys statistically asymmetrical non-elf creatures, not only demonstrate the kind of quirky and flavourful mechanics that I would hope to see in a return to the plane, but they also show that many of the enshrined aesthetic decisions, such as the horned and hooved elven blackshirts and the vibrantly diverse Boggarts, are still considered to be key components of this world and not at risk of a redesign, such as what happened to Mirrodin's Goblins. You know, part of me hopes that Magic never prints a new Slowbad card, frankly, because I've seen what Krark looks like, and I'd rather the best character in the entire of Magic's canon didn't also end up looking like Dobby experiencing a bad trip at Burning Man. Now that it's been proved that unpopular worlds, hell, even unpopular mechanics can become rekindled classics amongst the modern player base, provided that they're handled correctly, I can certainly see a future where we're finally able to see how the new split world of Lorwyn and Shadowmoor has unfolded. And I'm no games designer, but there are things that now exist in Magic that didn't at the time that Lorwyn and Shadowmoor existed that I think would massively benefit a return to the plane. Transform and bimodal cards are a norm that did not exist back in the mid-2000s and would be a huge boon to capturing the duality of this world. Narratively as well, it could be a palette cleanser set after all the guff with Phyrexia is squared away. Not unlike how Eldraine was a small-scale side story to lower the stakes after the culmination of War of the Spark. And what? I'm in the middle of recording. Wait, the Phyrexian arc is already going to be over and done with by mid-2023? And Eldraine is being returned to again as the palette cleanser set after March of the Machine? Well, thanks for telling me via the power of mime, I guess. Yes, I love you too. Well, fuck it. I didn't know how else to put this, but I want to talk about why Lorwyn is better than Eldraine some more. Sure, there's no way I'm going to keep this video to under 2 hours, but sometimes attack is the best form of defense, and you can't stop me! Lorwyn and Eldraine, a contrast of references. As I've said before, Eldraine is kind of the spiritual successor to Lorwyn, a plane inspired by British, Irish and Celtic myth and folklore, as well as stories either invented or retold by the German Brothers Grimm and the Danish Hans Christian Andersen. You've got The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Cinderella, the original ending of Cinderella, Merlin, Sir Gawain, the works. I have a mediocre video about it, you can see it here. It's a set brimming with direct analogues and references. Now, I've already made a fair few digs at Eldraine that I won't go over again. I will say that if you ask me which I prefer, a set with complicated board states and mediocre gameplay mechanics, or a set with cards which either broke formats or had novels printed on them, I'd take the silly Kithkin world any day of the week. But to round off what has been the central defense of this video, that of Lorwyn's world building, I want to talk about referencing versus interpretation. Lorwyn, in contrast to Eldraine's many direct references to Celtic tales, includes similar cultural iconography, but only hints towards folklore stories rather than creating one-to-one analogies. Jesus, I nearly fucking choked on that word. Take Mosswort Bridge and Mossbridge Troll that I mentioned in the Shadowmoor section of this video, for example. The two cards here are clearly linked by their name. Trolls living under bridges is a classic folklore and fairy tale image, most notably seen in 3 Billy Goat's Gruff, but these 2 cards are more than just a nod towards a cultural touchstone. Both the bridge card and the hideaway mechanic are absent from Shadowmoor, and the troll card, as well as the troll creature type, are absent from Lorwyn. They are linked, but separated, and thus it's implied that one has transformed into the other. Spine Rock Knoll, another hideaway land, resembles the Knoll Spine Dragon, but, as suggested by the flavour of Knoll Spine Invocation, which says that the knoll is now a ruin, presumably the Aurora awoke the dragon sleeping within the mountain, just as it must have awoken the troll slumbering within the bridge. With this in mind, Mosswort Troll isn't just the troll of Mosswort Bridge, but rather the twisted form of Mosswort Bridge, or at least has destroyed and supplanted the bridge, replacing the quaint helpfulness of a pretty bridge over a babbling brook with a lumbering, elongated titan of destruction. This particular reinterpretation of a classic image lends itself both to cementing Lorwyn and Shadowmoor as being rooted in some way in Celtic myth and classic fairy tale, but does so whilst also contributing to the whole set's theme of twisted duality, of light and of dark. The icon of the bridge being replaced with the icon of the troll. It's brilliant. Eldraine also dips into the classic trope of trolls and bridges with Clackbridge Troll, a troll named both after a bridge and after the sound that the 3 goats' hooves make on the bridge in the original story of Billy Goat's Gruff. The card also makes 3 goat tokens, and the art showcases a troll leering over 3 goats. Don't get me wrong, this is fine. I'm not saying that having magic card allegories of well-established characters or tropes is bad or lazy or anything like that. Hell, I think Clackbridge Troll itself is a really fun card. Again, I'm a mono black player. What do you give me a big dumb 8/8 for 5? I'm gonna fucking cream. God, Jesus, I need to fucking write things down. I can't just let it come off the cuff when I've been recording for hours on end. But when it comes to the texture of your story, direct references to tropes like this only serve as nods and winks for an audience rather than solid world building. Mosswort Bridge becoming Mosswort Troll tells the audience that this is a land of fairy stories, but also a realm of terror and danger when the sun eventually sets. All Clackbridge Troll tells the audience is that the game designers decided that 3 Billy Goat's Gruff was going to be one of the fairy tales they wanted to reference in this set. It's far more difficult to point out one-to-one references in Lorwyn than in Eldraine, but the world feels far more crafted and unique for it. It's paying tribute to tropes and reinterpreting them in a way that adds to the narrative they're trying to tell and the themes they're trying to tackle. It makes the world feel far more real, rather than having the world feel like a gallery of Easter eggs for obnoxious YouTubers to unpick in vapid do-nothing video essays that contribute less than a fraction of the original content's artistic worth back into the forum of discourse. Oh, you can critique, can you? Oh, you can point things out. How clever. How noble. Why don't you fucking do something with your life, you turgid hound? Gee, really going in on self-deprecating comedy today, aren't we? Anyway, the video's ending. Lorwyn is a complicated thing. The set itself has major technical flaws, which range from less than memorable set mechanics to obnoxiously complicated board states that got so bad, Magic fundamentally changed its design philosophy for all sets going forward. On first blush, the nuts and bolts of Lorwyn seem to be an indefensible mess. But, as I hope that this video has demonstrated, there's so much more about this set and this world that does work. I haven't even mentioned the laundry list of card designs that appeared in this set, which have become beloved staples of decks throughout all formats. Painter's Servants, Bitter Blossom, Door of Destinies, Scapeshift, the Tribal, Vivid and Filter lands, most of the Command Cycle and most of the original Planeswalkers are all classic cards for many players. Look, stop whinging. Red got a lot better as time went on. And to be absolutely clear, it's not like Lorwyn was a complete and utter disaster when it came to gameplay.
as far as gameplay went, I mean, I think its impact on standard for sure was great. All the fairy decks, were successful, perhaps to a fault. That was such a strange new archetype for us to work on. That the kind of disruptive tempo creature deck was not something that we had seen in a long time, and we overshot a little bit on that. But there were Kithkin decks, there were Doran decks, really a lot of cool stuff came out of that. So I'm pleased with how it turned out for standard. Something about the average player, the ingredients did not add up well, which was also true about Kamigawa, the first Champions of Kamigawa. And I think we did an excellent job of teasing out what was important, what to keep, and tuning the gameplay up on that set and the world building to make something awesome when we came back. So if and when we return to Lorwyn, I would love to do a similar rehabilitation on all axes of it, both gameplay and world building, to create something new and lovable that keeps intact the things that, and there are a lot of them out there, fans that enjoyed the first time we were there.
I maintain that even if the mechanics which enhanced it did so to the detriment of the set's gameplay quality, the storycraft and world building of Lorwyn is some of the best, nay, the best in Magic's history, thanks in no small part to the existence of those mechanics. There absolutely are clearer and less arcane ways of showing the interconnectivity of creatures within Magic's worlds that don't include multiple overlapping status effects at every level of rarity. But enshrining that narrative interconnectivity into mechanics is deeply important to bring disparate world-building ideas and societies within that world together. I really hope that Lorwyn's fresh world, one inspired by tales and myths from ours, not an amusement park of references for Planeswalker characters to traipse through on the way to solve some bigger crisis, serves as a blueprint for new worlds in Magic's future, or, at bare minimum, our eventual return to Lorwyn. I am forever drawn to the truly unique flavour of Lorwyn, how it stands at odds with modern Magic both mechanically and aesthetically. May the little nods we get here and there, a visit in Magic Origins, a card or two in Commander Legends, culminate in an exploration of that great narrative task of exploring the two fused worlds sometime in the future. I love you, Lorwyn. Yours are the only cards which I'll ever sprinkle into my morning porridge. Oh ho ho ho. Ha ha ha. Oh, die! 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 Well, I hope you all enjoyed that, folks. Sorry it got a little bit weird towards the end there. I got ill multiple times whilst making this video because it took so long to make. I'm actually still kind of ill now, and I wrote a lot of it whilst feverish, so that may explain some of the bizarreness. A big old thank you to everyone who contributed their voices to making this video possible. These include the ever-delightful Charlotte Sable, the ever-magnificent Lady Lavinia's, the ever-brilliant Sheepwave, the ever-fantastic Kiln Fiend Potter, the ever-industrious Professor, and the ever-funkalicious HBomberguy. And of course a massive additional thank you to Aaron Forsyth for agreeing to come on the channel and have a chat about Lorwyn with me. Super lovely of you to do that, Aaron. Big up to you, hope you're enjoying space.
It was an incredible learning opportunity for me. I think a lot of me figuring out what good Magic sets look like. Those lessons were learned with Lorwyn. I still have a soft spot for. I mean, at Lorwyn and Time Spiral are both sets that I feel like were full of mistakes. But at the same time, if you're into Magic the way I am into Magic, they are fun. And just trying to use that information to create something that's more broadly fun, but still fun for me, and still appealing to me. I appreciate that I had the opportunity to make all those mistakes on the way to where we are now.
I feel that all of these contributions made the video a lot better. However, this video flat out wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the support of my lovely and generous patrons, whose names you can currently see scrolling by on screen.
And I'd like to take this time to offer an additional thank you to all of my $10 patrons, who include 1, 2, 3, 4, I declare a class war, a filthy communist bunny, a fool of 5 colours, a gay American couple, a metric ton of bees, a pangolin-shaped servo, a screaming Batman, a waste of a perfectly good skeleton, Akumi the Reaper, Adam Gable, Adam Ross Henry, Aesthetic Dialectic, AJ Ingram, Alex Berman, Alex from Adelaide, Alguy D. Sisway, or Barry, Alice Paralis, Ali, an alt-right sleeper agent who gives money to communists, Bika Idaka, probably Tibble's for Sona, I draw penises on pastries, an exceedingly large moose, sorry, the contrast between those two is quite funny, an exhausted capybara, an Umbreon pastry, Andrew Elf, Anonymous Anarchist, Aqua Regina, Austin L, Bacchus98, Basugatsu Baku Hatsu Baku Matsu, Bazinga Bongos Badonkadonk Needs Love Too. One of the great things about doing like a video every couple of months now as opposed to a video once every month is that sometimes I forget about my Patreon credits names, and the joy reading them out brings is just brought straight back to the fold. Ben Pike, Ben Jai Skagboat Esquire the Fourth, Big Rat Games, Bitter Cup of Joe, Blake Evers, Bobby, Brian Dunn, Brian Rodham, but you can call me Thrakazod, Caleb Walton, Cancerian Insomniac, Karen Barboza, Charles Cohen, Chloe, Chromie, Krista Voss, CMDR0, not even going to try and pronounce that, Cognitive Glitch, Commie Mommy, Crocist, Curtis Paul Fleming, Darius Runabiner, Dark Kijin, Darth Pink Hippo, Deadpan Goth, Dean Pioquidio, Duncan Lindsay, Edward Gordon, Exidian, Eric Lindahl, Erin Slabar, Etienne Champion Masson, Everyone Loves Robots, Faxel, Felix Mortem, Fiona, Fofa, Foxy Dean, Future Beagle, Gab Larod, Judge of Jank, Gavin Verhey, oh hello Gavin again, Georg Anderson, Georgian Tom, Grand Regent Pie, Grey Days, Guilty Sonder, Homosexual Bird That Steals Shiny Things, How to PNP, Hoopered Up, Hypercube MTG. I'm abusing my powers to make Spicer 8-Rack say silly things like this. I am saying this only because our global economic system does not intrinsically support artistic expression. I just made you say Neverwhere, Boris. I want Emrakul to dominate me, I'm not dead, I just ran out of jokes, Imbecilicus Rex, in response I bolt myself, in response table flip, Jack Bland, Jack F, Jack the Mindfucker, Jackson Seamayer, Jackson West, Jacob Williams, Jake Colburn, JC Kairos, Jennifer Klein, Jess will eat the delicious cards yum yum, Joe Moynihan, Johnny Rifle, Jort Hermanus, Joshua M. Stephan, Julie Bunn, Julius Home, June Violet Ano, June, Duty Bound, Just Mild Lilac, Carlia Whithart, Kate B, Kay Santum, Koo Zombie, Komoli, Let Zimone Say Fuck, Rio, Kyle Denley, Leone Lover of Dragons, Lightfoot, Lily of the North Star, Lily Sappho, yes I gave myself 2 names that just mean lesbians, Literally a Ghost That Pushes Over Candles, Ill Milk Tray, Lonis, Crypto Marxologist, Linnea, Madame Monroe, Magic Arcanum, Magic Fellow, Marcellus Brown, Mario Romero, Matthew Miles, Matt S, Matthew Butler, Matthew Short, Max Makes Magic, Meow Serita, Metal Gamer 21, Micha, Midi Bat, Molly Felon, Moose, MTG Pack a Day, Nathan Speepisman Harris, N. Ben, Nicola Prisk, No, that's a new one, No Gods, No Double Masters, Num 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 Num, Yoshi, Ogrok and Ogrok Jr., Omar Altivaihi, One Single Mungus, pronounced like Mungus, like in humongous, feel free to read this part out as well, Onion Knight Val, Oops Alsini, Pappy Markov was a mistake, Patty Fism, Peter Carter, Filgamesh, Phoenix Swans, Procrastitron 3000, Punished Venom Scalene, Kwasu, Reblak, Replicase, Riley Quest, Rishi Sunak's welfare support. Ah, it finally reached me. Robson Yukon, Ross Conklin, Sam Cook, Scrimblow Bimblow, the lovable Scrunko, Sentient Simic Value Engine with no real wincon, several goblins in a trenchcoat, Sean, Shifty H, Skolaton, Sky Johnson, Sorry Zia, Stephen Christopher, Steve Grull, Stink Sty Fell Soria, Strange Friend, Swan Hunter, Tamio's New Phyrexian Orphanage, woof, Tanner the Big Sexy Dentist, Taylor Street, Thar's Refined Grizzly, the A-positive blood type Goddess of Death, the Boros are all bootlickers, all pigs, and no one can tell me otherwise, the Cutest Corgi, the Jellybean Warlock, the Poltism, the Farmer Cyrus, Thelon, the One Who Plays, the Reaper of You, Thomas Quinlan, Thomas Saint, Totally a Spy, aka He Who Simps for Emrakul, #FreeHer, Travis K, Vats3, Whopper, Watson Ann, Watcher9132, Well, You Asked For It, Wesley, That Rat Bastard Communist, William Cox, William Lyndon Smith, Yabu, Yuki Akama, Zach Ninja Attack, and Xanoron. And a massive thank you to all of my other patrons, a massive thank you to everyone who contributed to this video, and I'll see you all next time. And as always, stay spicy. Fuck, I broke my fucking... God fucking damn it. God fucking damn it, hang on. I broke my fucking spoon. I broke that spoon for that bit. I'm covered in oat milk. Fuck this set.